Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to my history channel. This is my part 10. As I said, I'm doing these in 10-minute blocks at this point, and I'm going to literally just dive straight in and carry on from where I was previously. So we left off where we were discussing the first sections of taxations that were generally done by the earlier Umayyads. As I previously said, during their 8th century to 9th century taxation system was a bit on the poor side. They were still adapting themselves, much like their counterparts, the Abyssinians, on the other side. All these were tax paid by Muslims. A document described the tax paid by villages in the Cordoba area in the early 9th century, incorporated into the 11th century geography of Al-Andalus, suggested that 49% of the revenue came from payments in place of military service, 45% were from Tabil, and a mere 4.7% from Sahadakia, Alams, and falconry licenses. In addition to these, there were taxes collected from the Christians. In the apologetic literature from the Christian martyrs of Cordoba, it is claimed that 100,000 dinars solidarity was collected from the Christians of Cordoba city alone. This is complete garbage. Absolute complete garbage, because this has been disproven on multiple occasions that this apologetical capacity that has been mentioned on more than multiple occasions in literature showed that there was 100,000 people to be sold. There wasn't. There is not even remotely that much. The poll tax was collected by Bishop Harsa, who went around all the churches to find details of the Christian populations in the parish register. If these figures are not widely extravagated, they make it clear that the physical obligations of Christians were very heavy in comparison with those of their Muslim counterparts. This has been categorically, historically disproven, and I keep reminding people about this, but when the Christians all take, the jizya was taxed heavily. There's no historical proof of it, in fact. There's no physical financial. This was, quite honestly, prefabricated. The information is clearly incomplete and presents a number of linguistical problems. It has also been proven by this documentation I'm just mentioning here, and I even consider this book to be a Christian apologetical letters, to be inaccurate and having very little in factual capacity. The most obvious in the relative importance of Cordoba and its districts as a source of revenue, since it contributed more than in other mentions areas combined. If Hassan does mean the payment of exempt from military service, and there seems to be no other possible interpretation, then the form of tax resembling practices in the Christian kingdoms of northern Spain at the late period were of the fond sordo, which means the same thing, was an important source of royal revenue. So the Christians and the Spanish were all creating a poll tax, the whole lot of them. They made a poll tax compatible system. Payments, for example, from the services of basis of many Western European medieval taxation system, English scrutinage, for example, but also unknown in the Eastern Islamic world. All the areas mentioned were once which had been settled by Syrian Judids who arrived with the Basrists in 741, and it is probably that they were paying to avoid the military service which would otherwise have been required in exchange for their lands. Similarity, payments for the rights to fly falcons are alien to classic Islamic taxations and must reflect local practices. On the other hand, the Qajrat land tax, which was the main physical pillar of the Eastern Islamic region, does not seem to have been established in Spain, nor at this stage do royal estates, surplus or dues appear as important sources of revenue. So this is where a deviation in the taxationable system between the Spanish Muslims and the classical Islamic Muslims. There is an actual difference between them. The third interesting feature of this list is that all revenues are said to have come from the south. As we might expect, neither the Marches nor the Levette are said to have made any contributions. It is true that this may well be no more than a gap in the evidence, but it certainly reflects the impression of other sources. The total sums of money available seem to have increased substantially from 600,000 dinars per year under Al-Hakrim to 1 million dinars under Abdul al-Rashid. These areas in the Gundabirable Valley and further south were the Haktokis, the main resource bases of the Umayyad Amirs, but further away from the capital the position was very different. The Umayyads spent more time trying to assert their authority over the northern areas of Al-Andalus than they did over the Christian lands. The areas on the Muslim side of the frontier were divided into marches, Thagreb, Pi and Thurat. The lower march is based on Merida, Bargeras, and the middle march is based on Toledo, and the upper march is in the Ebron Valley with its capital in Zagreb. The theory was that Muslims of the marchers had the responsibility of defending their areas against Christian attacks and supported any expedition the Muslims might make into the Christian territories. Like many of the administration devices of Al-Andalus, this had Eastern Islamic parallels in the thuggery which were established along the Arab-Byzantine frontiers in Syria and Al-Jazar. I don't know a great deal of the Byzantium stroke Eastern Islamic border territories, so I won't critique that because it's not in my speciality to do so. Like many of the administration devices of Al-Andalus, this had an An important feature of these Eastern thuggeries were their physical immunity. In recognition of their role in the perpetrated jihad, it seemed that the people of these areas were not obliged to make any financial contributions to the central government of the Caliph, and that, on the contrary, they received subsidies from their neighbouring areas. It seems likely that this system was continued in Al-Andalus in the information we have about the revenues of Cordoba's government. Now, we don't have enough evidence of the Cordoba government to say that this is absolutely the truth, but we suspect it is, because we're not entirely sure. With the physical independence that they were, went a broad measure of political separatism, in a way that this was directed by military considerations, since local commanders had to be able to respond to Christian raids without waiting for help from Cordoba. At the same time, this was also manifestos of more general ethnic divides and separatism feelings. Malwares in the park, and none of them knew anything of the matters until they told them. No doubt that this is idealistical picturing of a system which did not always work so well in practice. Now, my problem I've got with much of this book is how much the Christians are critique of the Islamic system of Al-Andalus, because it was, in a political system, a bastardization of classical Islamic with modern inventionism for its time period inside Spain itself, and it inherited a vast amount of Roman infrastructure that may have been crumbling, but they did actually inherit it. There is little evidence about the work of the Junid system in the Umayyad period. The only account we have I gone back? Give me a second. So, with the physical independence, there was a broad measure of political separatism in a way that was directed by military considerations. Toledo, Valencia, Termed, Murcia and Bajan, as well as the Red and Elvires and Al-Andalus, despite the similarities of title, the nature of these appointments were very different. Rio and Elvires and Tudmir are only recorded as being held by the emir's sons, and so were presumably within his power. Toledo saw frequent changes of governors chosen from the members of the Cordoverian bureaucracy families, the Banazu, the Banzai, Binu, Salem, Banu Basal, who had, as far as we can tell, no local connections. This again suggested a fair degree of real authority from Cordoba. Valencia was governed by one of the Umayyads, who is mentioned in the context of the expedition which forced the submission of the Baltic Islands in 848. After the fleet returned, the emir set one of his fatahs to supervise Ibn May's division of the booty and make sure that he got his fifth share. In the upper march, Abdul al-Bi Khalid, the man who erected the citadel and inscribed inscription at Merida, was in charge in Zagreb in 848, but had to compete against the rival power of Musaf bi Qualad in Tulad. The case of Bargeras is different against here. The governor of Faljan bin Karin al-Turek is said to have rebelled in 847 to 8. Abdul al-Rashid hastened in person to confront him. In return for acknowledging him as emir, Abdul Rashid was generous to him and increased his status, formally appointing him as governor, Wali of Biaj. He soon reasserted his independence, and in fact his sons continued to be powerful in the Algarves until the next century. Clearly Fajr was in a very difficult position from that governors of Toledo, appointed and dismissed at will. He was rather a quasi-independent local magnate, and the power of Cordoba in his lands was strictly limited. Now, we don't know how much of this is actually true. Again, the chronicles are very limited on how much central structure and central historical implication was actually there. These are the assumptions of much of this book, and I don't necessarily disagree with this, because there was a level of decentralization from what we understood, historically speaking. That is my second 10 minutes, and it brings us to the land of the northern frontier. And I will likely do two more 10-minute parts tomorrow. I'm going to head off and do my first part of the Ottomans now. Alhamdulillah, I hope you enjoyed.